Hi friends, I'm back with the rest of chapter 4 of Socks. And if you remember when we were last reading, Socks was put on a diet by Mr. and Mrs. Bricker, and he was not too happy. So he was going around the neighborhood to see what kind of food he could find or what kind of food people would give him. And we're going to continue reading to see if he is successful. Where could Socks beg next? Cats and dogs made the territory in front of the house dangerous. The evil jays, having hidden their peanuts, were now finding them on the rooftops to crack them. The sight of the jolly black cat sunning himself on the back fence was discouraging. Socks slunk home and let himself in through the open window. As his paws hit the floor, there came a sound he had not heard before, not since the arrival of Charles William. The sound of Mrs. Bricker tapping down the hall in her going out for the evening shoes. Instantly, he was alert for the answer to two important questions. Would he be fed before his owners left, and would he be shut inside or outside of the house? Preow, Socks half purred and half meowed as he rubbed against the legs of Mr. Bricker, who was sitting on the bed trying on his shoes. Mr. Bricker responded by rubbing his cat's head roughly and affectionately, but he made no more of an attempt. Mrs. Bricker tapped down the hall into the bedroom with Charles William in her arms. "Is our big boy going to miss his mommy and daddy?" she asked. "Preow," begged Socks at his most charming attempt. "Preow." "Yes," said Mrs. Bricker. "The kitty's talking to the baby." She was wrong. Socks was not talking to the baby. He never talked to the baby. "Do you think Charles William will mind us going out?" the young mother asked anxiously as Charles William grabbed a handful of her long hair. "He's beginning to understand so many things." "If he does mind, he'll have to get used to the idea," said Mr. Bricker. "Mom said we were to spend the check she sent on the babysitter and go out for an evening. You need to get out once in a while, and the world is full of babies who have survived an evening with a sitter." Preow. A cat needed attention too. "All right, Socks, you old beggar," said Mr. Bricker. "Let's feed you and get you out of the way." Socks's victory was small. 4 pieces of meat, and while he was gulping them down, the doorbell rang. The sound always unsettled him, but curiosity forced him to investigate. Mrs. Bricker opened the front door to a plump elderly woman who was carrying a paper shopping bag, and who introduced herself. "I am Mrs. Risley from the Sitters Service Agency." She entered and leaned her shopping bag against the chair with the loopy upholstery. "Hello there, young man," she said to Charles William, as she removed her coat and, without waiting to be asked, hung it in the closet beside the front door. Socks sniffed at the shopping bag. He stood on his hind legs with his front paws against the chair and peered into the bag, but all he could see was some yarn and some knitting needles. He dropped to all fours and sniffed again. "Interesting." "Well, hello." All cats were kind and friendly with Mrs. Risley, or so she seemed to expect them to be, who stooped to rub Socks behind the ears. "My, aren't you a big handsome boy with a nice thick coat?" Socks sat down and looked up at Mrs. Risley with love in his eyes. Here, at last, was a true admirer, his first since the baby had arrived. "Charles William has had his supper," said Mrs. Bricker, who had not trusted a stranger to feed her baby. "But he will want a bottle when he goes down for the night. He's big enough to hold his bottle now on his own, and he doesn't need to be burped anymore." "And what about the cat?" asked Mrs. Risley. "What do I feed him?" "He's been fed," answered Mrs. Bricker, with her eyes on her son. "And don't let him tell you he hasn't. He's quite a beggar, but for a while he was getting too fat. For your supper there is—" "Oh, don't worry about me," said Mrs. Risley. I always bring a meat patty with me. Oh, these jobs, you never know what you're going to find to eat. Some places all you get is a can of soup or a waffle. She reached for Charles William, who looked surprised and uncertain. He turned to his mother for some explanation, and he whimpered. He's going to be all right. Mr. Bricker firmly guided his wife to the door. Charles William began to cry, and Sock stopped his investigation of the shopping bag. He looked anxiously at the three adults, wanting them to attend to the baby. Don't you worry about a thing, said Mrs. Risley. He'll stop crying as soon as you leave. They always do. Mrs. Risley was right. As soon as his parents disappeared, Charles William discovered the scarf below Mrs. Risley's double chin and stopped crying. He had never seen a scarf like hers before and found it interesting. Ay, 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 the baby said. That's better, said Mrs. Risley, and sat Charles William in his playpen. She began to rummage in her shopping bag. I call this my survival kit, she said to Socks, who was peering into the bag to see if she had something for him. From the jumble of knitting, crayons, scissors, colored paper, magazines, and bedroom slippers, Mrs. Risley produced a roll of Scotch tape and, tearing off a piece, stuck it firmly to the big toe of Charles William's bare left foot. There, she said, that will keep you busy. Once again, she was right. Charles William stared at his toe in astonishment. Never before had he experienced Scotch tape on his foot. He lay back and waved his foot. The tape stuck fast. Fascinating. Ah-ga-ga, he said. Mrs. Risley was now available to devote her entire attention to Socks. This remarkable woman, who knew where to find things in a strange house, found Socks's brush in the laundry and went to work brushing him with long, hard strokes. Socks stood with his back braced and his chin raised, luxuriating in the tingle of the brush as it went through his fur. All the time Mrs. Risley brushed, she talked. Poor kitty, she said tenderly. With a baby in the house, he feels nobody loves him. Well, Mrs. Risley loves him. With the tip of her finger, she rubbed his nose, where the hair grew short and flat. How good it felt. Yes, he is a handsome boy. Socks agreed. And you can see there's a picture here of Mrs. Risley brushing Socks. When Mrs. Risley cooked and ate her meat patty, she served Socks a morsel. Just enough so you won't feel left out, she explained. We can't let such a handsome boy get fat, can we? No, that wouldn't do at all. Somehow Socks did not mind receiving only one small bit of meat. By this time, Charles William had exhausted the possibilities of Scotch tape and was beginning to get cross with it. He had pulled it from his toe, stuck it to his right hand, and then his left, back and forth, and finally succeeded in sticking it to his brown bear. He did not want Scotch tape stuck to Brown Bear. Charles William fussed, and Socks looked anxiously at Mrs. Risley. Now don't you worry, said Mrs. Risley, pausing to stroke the tabby's head. I'll be right back. Socks was so relaxed that only a moment seemed to go by from the time Charles William was lifted from his playpen until he was smacking away at his bottle in the bedroom crib. Mrs. Risley pulled a magazine from her survival kit and plumped herself down on the couch, where she patted her lap. Now, she said to Socks, as if this was the moment she had been waiting for. This was the moment Socks had been waiting for, too. He leaped lightly onto the sitter's lap, which was large, soft, and sweetly perfumed by flower-scented soap. Mrs. Risley possessed the perfect lap, a lap rarely experienced by a cat who lived in a world of people determined to stay thin. Except for Socks's deep purr, the room was very quiet. In Charles William's room, the smacking stopped, but this time Socks had no interest in leftover formula. He no longer had an empty feeling in his middle. The bottle fell out of the crib with a thump, and the silence that followed meant that Charles William was asleep for the night. Socks began to knead the perfect lap with his paws in and out, in and out. His purr deepened, and a dreamy look came into his golden eyes. In and out, in and out. With his eyes half closed, Socks felt as if he were with his mother and the rest of the litter that he had almost forgotten. Socks lost all interest in washing. He lay down on the perfect lap and wiggled until he was laying on his back with his 4 feet in the air, and his spine in the trough between Mrs. Risley's plump thighs. Gently and rhythmically, she stroked his silky fur on his trusting belly. "Poor old Socks," whispered Mrs. Risley as she stroked Socks's glossy fur. "You were starved for a little bit of love." She turned the pages of her magazine carefully so they would not flick his whiskers and the sound would not disturb him. Gradually the purrs peered out, and with a final sigh, Socks fell into a deep, deep sleep. The first perfect sleep he had enjoyed since Charles William had been carried home from the hospital. Mrs. Risley loved him more than she loved his rival. And you can see there's Socks falling asleep. And that is the end of the chapter. So, more so than the food Socks was looking for, he found a little bit of love with Mrs. Risley, and he got the attention that he's been wanting so badly. So keep up your awesome pictures, friends. I've been loving all the emails I've been receiving. It's great to see your artwork and to hear from you all. So take care, and I'll be back tomorrow with the start of chapter 5. Bye-bye.